here.
It's totally like a performance.
Hi, my question is for Dr. Bonanno. It's actually a multi-question. I find that when I speak to people who are not in academia,
I'm sorry, I can't quite hear you. Can you speak?
When I speak to people not in academia, they tend to deny what we find through research, and they're somewhat put off sometimes, as in the case of for instance, as example, when we speak of Kubler-Ross and we say, you know, her research has been debunked, it's not valid, and we don't use those stages anymore, people are still, they listen and they go, oh, that's interesting, but I'm still going through the stages. So how would you respond to people who are still, who are not in academia, who find it uncomfortable to accept this resilient trajectory as what most people are going through? And
I guess it depends who they are and why they'd be talking to me about it. When I published a book for the general public, and I looked at the reviews on Amazon, and a lot of people liked it a lot, and some people really, really hated it. And the people that really hated it were people in a lot of pain. And I think they misconstrued the idea of focusing on resilience, meaning that you shouldn't have any pain at all. And that was actually a really important lesson for me, because it changed the way I talk about such things. And I got more interested in, making sure I talked about the different types of outcome people have, the heterogeneity and how people respond. I think in terms of things like stages, if somebody told me that they believed in stages and the stage theory helped them cope with their loss, I don't think I'd say another word. I'd let them have that's their belief, and if it's helpful. If people ask me in other contexts, I haven't, my observation has been that people have been the general public is much more accepting of these ideas over the years. It's really increased. And in fact, the biggest resistance I've got recently has been in academia.
And one other question regarding resilience, and you said it's a lot of little slices that can predict resilience. Is there anything, in your opinion, that someone can actively do to make themselves more resilient?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I've written a lot about this because I think that it's a tricky business talking about resilience building, because there's an implicit communication that if people are trying to build their resilience, so maybe they're not resilient already. And I think we typically do pretty well, most of us. So I think if we're going to talk about building resilience, it would probably be, there are two ways to go. One would be a deficits model where we actually assess ourselves, or other people assess other people, on the factors we think promote resilience. But that's tricky because there are many different factors, and one could compensate by these different factors. The other thing, though, I think, is just general health building, and there are several approaches. One is mindfulness, and mindfulness is one of those words that's become kind of useless because it's such a large catch-all phrase. But the mindfulness type practices tend to do a lot of things. They tend to reduce stress. They tend to make people more socially active. They tend to make people more confident. And you can check off all these things that a mindfulness practice might do, and those are all generally good things and are all on the list of things that promote resilience. The other thing is that I've been most interested in the last 10 years, or actually about 15 years now, in what I'm calling regulatory flexibility. It's a suite of behaviors that we study in the lab, and that we try to understand as components of a broader notion of being able to flexibly interact with stressors in the world. And flexibility is very interesting to me and to the people in my lab, because it's a suite of behaviors. So it suggests a kind of a set of processes rather than just one dimension. And we think that it's potentially something that we can inculcate in people, both for general health and possibly also to ensure that they'll be more resilient, or they will be resilient. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? I have a question for Tanya. I was really interested in, you compare your participants with a PTSD diagnosis versus those who are not. And those who are not is a really interesting group because they're trauma exposed but haven't developed the diagnosis. And so it makes me wonder about the third group of the trauma unexposed and how the PTSD negative trauma exposed compare to the trauma unexposed.
So we don't have that in our data set, but looking at other people's work where they've used like a healthy control comparison, they would look like our trauma-exposed non-PTSD group. So looking at prefrontal inhibition, it would look more like, again, I don't have a direct comparison, but typically they don't show this hypoactivation, much like the PTSD. So the trauma-exposed non-PTSD adults look more like you would expect a healthy control to look like. And it might be interesting to see whether you actually might see better effects, something that George's been seeing, maybe an improvement post-trauma. And we talk a lot about post-traumatic growth and things like that, that there may be things that, you know, if something doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger, that it might actually promote more inhibition or something like that. So again, having that third group would be really valuable for that reason. We just don't really have that through the way we recruit data.
How do you explain the rationale between hippocampal activation and higher resilience?
Can you repeat that last part?
How do you explain the rationale between hippocampal activation and high resilience?
Activation and high resilience.
Hippocampal activation, is that for me? Or who are you asking specifically? Yeah. How do we explain it? So I think, you know, potentially there might be something about, you know, the genetics and maybe the dopaminergic system. So we don't know the biology of it that well. So the reasons for why hippocampal activation might be more active in some people than others, we don't know yet. The reasons why hippocampal activation itself might be protective is one of the things is that maybe being able to appropriately respond to safety signals. And so we know that hippocampus is involved in learning safety signals, responding to safety signals, contextualizing safety information. And so navigating a world where you can discriminate between danger and safety might be more protective. So that would be one potential explanation for that, and there might be others as well.
Thank you.
So my question was for Dr. Bonanno. So I was just wondering whether there were particular, I don't think that you have this data, but whether any data exists or what your predictions would be about the early life experiences that might lead to these particular different trajectories, particularly resilience.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and I think lots of people are interested in that. In the answer to that question now, there's a lot of interest in how early life adversity maps out over the lifespan. I think the clearest evidence has been for epigenetic modifications in predicting PTSD or psychopathology. I think when we think about why people are, one of the questions I often think about is why the resilience trajectory is, say, 70%, which suggests it's the common response, but why is it not 90%? And I think part of the reason is because of the complexity of our stress response system and how long development unfolds in humans. And I suppose that there's something similar in animals in terms of when it's scaled to years, but that suggests a long period of influences on unfolding development of the brain, and there's lots of room for things to go right and lots of room for things to go wrong. So I think the epigenetic changes, lots of people are studying that, and we see those kind of changes in the, as I said, in the psychopathology outcomes. I don't know of any work at this point associating anything with resilience, but that's really the normative response, so I think that's probably when things kind of unfold more or less as they should. So that seems to me fairly, that's a kind of a simple answer, but that's what we have at this point. Unless any of you have, maybe Regina have different answer?
No, I think your answer was appropriate. Actually, if I could ask you a question as well.
Okay.
What number of subjects do you need to do this modeling? Is it 1,000, or there are ways that you could do this with, 50 or 30 animals?
We've done there have been some simulation studies that suggest a magic number of 200.
200.
But in the rodent studies, we've done it with less. Because there we're looking at only 20 trials. We're not looking at years. One of the problems with smaller samples is that the groups can be very small. So one of the groups might be 10%, but if you have 100 people, that's only 10 or 10 rodents. And so prediction is difficult. There are people, though, exploring Bayesian models right now. And so, in fact, we've got a kind of a project going in the Netherlands where we've talked about this, and I currently don't know where it's at because it's a complicated story, but it was to do repeated studies, fear conditioning studies with mice, and to each time do a Bayesian correction to get smaller and smaller samples. And then at some point switch to rats and see if the Bayesian model would predict rat behavior in very small samples. And that's really, it's a good idea, and I think it would work. The problem, as I said, though, is then you might have 50 rats or 50 rodents, but you couldn't do much in terms of predicting those groups because they'd be such small groups. But you could see the patterns anyway.
So it seems to me that this is a really good model in which you could make bridges between animal models and the human literature, which I'm always looking for. I think everybody's always looking for how do you build those bridges between looking at animal models, the mechanism, and human data where you can't do that.
Absolutely, I think so, yeah, totally. And it hasn't, and Isaac, who I mentioned, and you just told me that you know
Yes.
Isaac, Isaac really led that study, and he's been involved in, I think, 4 other studies now replicating those findings.
Yeah,
Does he do
we're
something
one
with
of
you
them,
too?
yeah.
Isaac gets around.
Yeah.
And,
In a good way.
yeah, in a good way. Yeah, that's not bad. In a good way. And so I think there was surprisingly little work like that. So and it's kind of really suggesting a lot of possibilities. I think many possibilities.
Okay, George, I have one more trajectory question. So following a traumatic event, you had some people who started high, stayed high, low, low. There was one graph that showed a nonlinear path where people following a trauma kind of got worse, but then they got better.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever seen the opposite pattern where following a trauma, people initially look like they improved, but then in the long term, they got worse? I don't remember seeing that in any of your
I'm
plots.
thinking in some of the studies where we had long periods of time, we see things like that. When we go out, I think in one of the military studies we're now doing, we have up to 9 years. But then you start getting into the realm of other events happening in people's lives. Typically, when you see worsening, you typically see a pattern of, there was a classic idea years ago when, before people really accepted that there was a resilience trajectory, really, people often talked about good health early on as just a mirage, and that you would then develop this delayed response. And it turns out we never see that pattern of healthy functioning and then much worse functioning. We do see the pattern, though, of moderate functioning that gets worse. So people are struggling to some extent, and after a period of months, when they're not getting any better, they start getting worse. And that's sometimes because of another event. It's sometimes because they get depressed about the fact that they're not getting any better. So that's the classic pattern, and that's been seen in trajectory studies and in non-trajectory studies as well. But there may be patterns that we still haven't seen. I mean, we've tended to stay in a fairly finite range of types of events we've looked at. So there may be, and this approach can be applied to all kinds of other things, as we've just talked about. But I haven't seen that pattern yet.
Could I follow up on Nim's question? It's George.
Oh, sorry.
Anyway, I just wanted to follow up. And did you ever find, to follow up on Nim's question, that, for example, the resilience in young adults or adolescents was better than, for example, people who had traumas or surgeries or other things happen after the age of 50 or 60, in terms of the percentage or proportion of resilience in that population?
Well, that's a really great question, because there's been quite a heated debate about this. and I've unfortunately got myself mixed up in this debate a little bit. In the developmental literature, and I don't know if I can speak so broadly, but in the developmental literature, that people tend to focus on different patterns. And initially, we had a lot of discussion when I was on panels with developmental researchers who were interested in resilience, because they were telling me that the patterns I was showing were wrong, that they look this other way. And they were looking at something more like recovery. So that was puzzling, and after a long period of time, I finally worked out a solution that I like, and I don't know if other people like it or not, but that most of the developmental research pertains to chronic adversity. And so chronic adversity leads to a pattern which I alluded to at the beginning of the talk, which I call emergent resilience. And emergent resilience does not look like this flat line, because in the context of chronic adversity, it's pretty hard to be completely symptom-free. So you see much more variability and moderate to higher levels of distress. Even though people might be functioning, they might be doing what they need to do, working or going to school or whatever they're doing, but they're struggling a bit in both children or adults. And then when the stressor event ends, so if it's chronic abuse, the chronic abuse ends. If it's civil war, the civil war ends. You see this fairly steady reduction in some people into the normal range. And we started calling that emergent resilience. But that's for chronic adversity. And then as we began to think about this, we began to find studies, and people would send me studies after I started publishing this, of children exposed to acute life stressors. And there we see, when there's an acute life stressor, we see that flat pattern in children as well as adults. The proportions have been about the same. Now, in terms of older adults, so children and adults exposed to acute adversity show about the same prevalence of resilience. That's across many studies. As far as older adults, there's a lot fewer research with older adults, but a lot of the HRS data sets I showed you were with older adults. So there we're seeing somewhat similar patterns as well. So if anything, older adults I think might cope a little bit better, as a number of studies suggest, but by and large we haven't seen major differences by age. It's really the type of event.
Hi, this question is for anyone who might have thoughts on it. And it's inspired by some reading I was doing on Judith Herman. I've been thinking a lot about how one's identity as a trauma survivor affects either resilience or maintenance of trauma symptoms. And I was wondering if anyone has any information or data on how one's identity as a trauma survivor, for example, if someone comes back from war and they identify as a soldier, if either the post-traumatic growth helps them develop, resilience afterwards, or conversely, as I was reading a bit, if it can be harder to let go of those symptoms because they are salient to their very meaningful experience. Does that make sense?
I have one little piece to answer that, and that is the pattern where we've seen improvement over time, where a person was not doing well and they improved after an event. That pattern, one of my former students, Anthony Mancini, who's at Pace University, just did a study, published a study in Clinical Psych Science on mass shooting data. And he identified a group of about 10% from the Virginia Tech shooting, where the students were depressed or anxious before the shooting, then after the shooting they had no longer depression or anxiety, and that held for about a year afterwards as far as they were collecting data. And they found that they had marked increases in social support and available social resources. So that would be kind of linked to their identity as someone who'd gone through that event. Because they had gone through that event, they got a lot of attention and a lot of supportive resources. So that would work in the favorable way. The other part of your question was whether people might they might hang on to the symptoms because the symptoms link them to the event?
Maybe not purposefully, but
yeah. I don't know about that part, but yeah, that's the piece that I can answer.
okay. Thank you.
I mean, I would say just anecdotally from all the interviews we're doing at Grady, we typically hear a lot of especially in domestic violence situations, women who were in abusive relationships previously will identify themselves as having survived this, and that tends to be very promoting of resilience. So we've seen that to be more positive. If they can identify as someone who's made it past it and they've learned from it and now they're willing to help others, we see this, again, I don't really have data on that. I'm sure it's somewhere in our massive data set, but specifically asking about identity as trauma survivor, I don't know that we have that other than the anecdotal data.
Thank you. And there's some data on trauma bonding. Have you heard that term?
Mm-hmm.
So that the patient sometimes will like or be attracted to some aspects of the trauma. And we see that in our animal model in early life, where the odor associated with the trauma for the baby rat pup is approached and seems to function as a safety signal on some level throughout the lifespan. So we do know that there are some odd or paradoxical aspects of trauma where cues associated with the trauma do provide some sort of comfort. It's actually Carrie who I spoke with when I first got this data. And there is some aspect of the psychological literature. Maybe there's a psychiatrist here that can respond to that question a bit better. But obviously it's a very complex process of trauma. People don't always avoid the trauma situation again and again. Thank you. Is there a psychiatrist here that would? George? So do you see that in your patients at all where?
I don't have any patients.
You don't see patients?
I haven't seen patients in 25 years.
Yeah. Francis, you're a clinician.
Hi, my question is more related to, I don't know if it's still relevant, to the question about resilience and the age relationship that was previewed by Francis. Yes, so it just occurred to me, I don't know for anybody of you, then what is your take on resilience and the executive functioning then? Since it looks like it's more, resilience will be more prone to succeed in terms of older individuals. So I don't know if it makes sense, but for anybody who can, what will be your take on the relationship between resilience and executive functioning?
I'm trying to think of what we have other than, the data, we do a neuropsych battery, but I don't have the data on that. So the response inhibition is a very simple task. I wouldn't really think of it as executive function, although it may be some component of executive function. And frontal activation, we know, is associated with executive function. So I would say that I would expect there to be a pretty significant association between prefrontal activation, executive function, and higher resilience.
It's also making me think about data that would suggest that resilience may be domain specific, and there may be resilience in some aspects of functioning, but you might see a toll in other areas. So there are many examples of this, but I'm thinking in particular of Edith Chen's work that has shown that adults who experienced chronic stress early in life, who are highly regulated individuals, often show a lot of physical wear and tear and accelerated aging, so epigenetic aging, for example. And so I think, I don't know if the panel would agree with me, that it might be more appropriate to look at particular domains of functioning when asking questions about resilience.
I'd actually, if I can ask you three a question, particularly Nim and Regina. Regina, you had mentioned the smell, and Nim, you had these great findings of the scent, and you had these great findings of the people who like Backstreet Boys, was it? And that I'm curious about these early adaptations that are in an unfavorable context, where a child or a young animal adapts in a way that requires some changes in brain functioning that are perhaps not ideal, but they are very adaptive in the time, and how that plays out across the lifespan, and whether one might find a way, this is really more speculative, I think, whether people can find ways to live within those sort of modified ways of functioning in a very successful way, say by not allowing themselves to get in situations where they can't cope so well, or say this may explain why people listen to oldies radio all the time or something. But do you have thoughts about that?
That is a question, that's the million-dollar question for us, is so if we're interpreting brain differences during development as adaptations, what we want to know is what is the longer term, is there a longer term cost, or have we identified a neural signature of resilience within a particular domain? We don't know in the long run, but our findings of neural precocity, if that's what they are, remind me of the older clinical literature on early parentification in children whose parents are not ideal caregivers or can't provide care. And in many respects, they act like older kids, and they're taking care of their siblings and household and taking care of their parents many times, but there often is a longer term cost in terms of internalizing problems. And I don't know if what we're seeing at the level of neurobiology maps onto that, but it at least has a similar scent about it.
So we think of it in terms of normal experiences, some of which are stressful, some of which are not, are important in programming brain development. And the human brain has this flexibility so that those can help you adapt to a wide variety of environments. I think one of the issues about early life trauma is that it goes beyond adapting to the environment and produces pathological behavior. So it's one of the things that we focus on one of our longer term tests, where for example, when these pups grow up, they make horrible mothers and put their pups in danger, whereas a typical healthy typical parent would protect their child in horrible situations. This rat doesn't. So, I mean, and there's no way that could be adaptive for either for them individually, because reproduction is highly costly, but also for the species. So there's something about early life trauma, we think, especially when it's within attachment, that is more likely to produce these pathological behaviors. But we don't know for sure.
I'm so sorry. This is amazing. I have to catch a train, but you guys keep going, and
well,
thank you.
Actually, we really are just about at the end of time. We do have one more brief question that we have time for maybe a 1-minute answer.
Thank you very much.
Hi, so Dr. Bonanno, on one of the slides you showed the bereavement study where the widowhood, they reported that in terms of life satisfaction after the loss is very low, and then after a while it went up. So I was wondering whether you had come across the literature as to, I'm sure this answer is very complex in terms of the factors that lead to the improvement of life satisfaction, but I was wondering if there were any specific factors that led to the improvement of life satisfaction.
I'm sorry, didn't quite hear what you said. So what was the last part? What was the question?
So in terms of the widowhood, what are some specific factors that might lead to the improvement of life satisfaction after spousal loss?
Do you mean the recovery pattern?
Mm-hmm.
When
yeah.
One of the things that we've noticed in some of the other studies was, well, I can speak generally to that pattern. I think life satisfaction showed very similar findings. It's fairly similar patterns in terms of lack of depression and things like that. But one of the things we've seen in the recovery pattern was in bereavement, was the ability to find comfort from positive memories of the deceased. So resilient people can do that right away, or at least as soon as we can measure it. They report that they can conjure the memory of the person they lost, and they're comforted by that memory. They have a positive reaction to that memory, and they find comfort. Whereas other bereaved people aren't able to do that. And when people move back into the normal range, it turns out they can do it then. And there was a beautiful description of this in the book by C.S. Lewis called Grief Observed. He wrote a short little beautiful book about his wife's death. It was made into a movie with Anthony Hopkins and Deborah Winger. Yeah, it's a beautiful book, beautiful movie. And he talked about how difficult it was for him early on because he could not remember his wife very well, and he felt like he lost her twice. He lost her because she no longer lived, and he lost her because he couldn't conjure to mind all the wonderful images and memories he had of her. And then, as he recovered, suddenly she began to appear in his mind again. He was so relieved by that, but that went hand in hand with recovery. So that was a big one. At this point, my brain is sort of shutting off, and I can't remember other ones.
Thank you. That's a great note to end on, and thank you so very much, panel. That was a great discussion. And now Dr. Francis Lee will make concluding remarks and give the poster awards.
Thank you so much. I assure you this will take about 3 minutes, so please stay. I want to spend most of the time giving the poster awards. I want to have them come up first and stand here after I give them all. The first place award for the best poster is Jonathan Tobin. The second place award is for Marajita Lapkovic. Third place award is to Josephine McGowan. And my favorite poster award is the People's Choice Poster Award, which goes to Kizzy Vasquez. Are any of them, if you could all come up or just stand and get a round of applause? Yeah. So as you know, the symposium is not just speakers, but also all the trainees who prepared their posters. And I just want to thank you for participating. Thank you. Okay. So I promised I'd give a 1-minute summation. I'd just like to say that today, I think we learned a couple things about, as was brought up in the first panel discussion and the second panel discussion, first of all about the idea of how we treat the patient of today. And I know Eric Nestler and others were rather negative about it because the brain is so complicated, but I'd just like to say it is quite amazing that even though we don't understand the brain in any sort of granular way, we actually have good medication treatments that treat about 30 to 40% of the people out of sheer luck. I mean, this is something that we should all be that we won the lottery and we found some drugs that help people with psychiatric disorders. Second of all, we also have very good psychotherapy that works also for 30 to 40% of the patient population. So it also suggests that psychotherapy is something that should be looked at further. I would have to just end by saying, I think what we learned from this symposium is that for the patient of tomorrow, we really need to study this whole concept of resilience, because ultimately, if you think about it, it's still stunning to me that you can have mice or rats that are genetically identical and will have resilience to both social defeat or fear conditioning, or as George mentioned, 60 to 70% of the people that can actually be quite resilient to significant stresses. And I think the future will be to try to not only find these people, but try to figure out ways to understand the molecular pathways for this active type of resilience, and also various interventions that will promote this. Anyway, and finally, I would just like to spend the last 30 seconds thanking our gifted co-chairs who came up with this topic of resilience, which is Tracy and Glenn. I think without them, they were the driving forces. We were essentially a group of very large cats, and they kept on herding us together. And finally, I'd like to thank Denise Charles, who was our coordinator, who was ultimately the one that made this happen. Thank you again, and enjoy your evening. Bye.